Hello, friends. For the next 2 weeks, we'll be reading texts about sin and forgiveness and confrontation. If you are not a particularly confrontational person, this might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. This is where it's maybe nice for you that you're sitting at home. You can feel uncomfortable all by yourself if you're not with a group of people. If you are with a group of people, perhaps you could slide out of the room. Of course, you won't do that because that would draw everyone's attention, and you like to avoid any confrontations over it. But either way, as we look at confrontation over these 2 weeks, I've been excited to spend them on these passages with you. These are crucial for how we live as a community together. In fact, I wonder if the beginning of the end for a lot of Christian communities came when they forgot or misused the things that we find here. Whenever we baptize people here at Offerings, when they come officially into the fold of the church, we say this: we will surround these people or this person with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their service to others. We will pray for them that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that leads to life. What does it mean to be a community of love and forgiveness? We get some great guidance here. What we'll focus on today is, in some ways, family business. I'll explain a bit more about why I say that in a minute. So if you're a guest, if you still consider yourself an outsider, not yet a full part of this community, maybe you're watching online and have not joined us and don't really feel like a part yet, I hope this will be helpful to you still. As a community, we're trying to reflect the character of God and how we behave. So while we're talking about family business, my hope is that if you're an outsider, you see something about God's character and about the kind of people that God calls us to be. So this first little bit is going to be high on observation, low on preaching. I'm going to start by focusing on the instructions as we see them here and what exactly they say. Then after that, I want to highlight why these instructions are a part of the gospel, how something that sounds like a set of rules that we may not like is actually right at the heart of the good news. Okay, let's get right into it. Let's look at this passage together, starting right at Matthew 18, verse 15. And we're going to do this just a bit at a time. Matthew 18, verse 15 says, "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault." Stop there. Actually, we're going to stay right here for quite a while. Let's start by just observing what's said and what's not said right here at the beginning. I think there are at least 3 major things in this little sentence that could change the way we live if we took them seriously. Observation number 1. If your brother or sister. Who is this about? I want to claim for you that it's not about everyone. Whenever we see brother or sister language in the scriptures, in the New Testament, we're talking about the church. We're talking about this group of Christians who are drawn up into a special family. This is a note about how to live together as that family. And it isn't telling us to go into the world and hold up signs. It's not this. And it's not this. Is it? We've been called judgmental for that before, haven't we? And I lament that because I know a large section of our society thinks that Christians are judgmental, specifically that Christians are bent on pointing out everyone else's sins. This is why we're often called hypocrites. We're called pretenders. We pretend like there's nothing wrong with us on the inside while we criticize the people on the outside. And some of us, on the other hand, we've become uneasy with anything that could look judgmental. Jesus said, "Do not judge," right? And so we finish the sentence this way: if your brother or sister sins, well, that's between them and God. Who am I to judge? To be honest, if it were that simple, I think I'd feel much more comfortable. Am I my brother's keeper? Kind of this, hey, I'll let them and God deal with that and I won't get involved. But I don't think we can get off that easy. Is there a place for judging in the church? I think we have to say that there is. Later, in a letter to a group of Christians in Corinth, Paul writes, "What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside?" There's a difference in approach, isn't there? So observation number 1, this passage that we're reading right now, this is about the church, and we have to read it with respect to the church. Here's observation number 2. It says, if your brother or sister sins. This is about sin. Can't get anything past me, can you? here's my theory. I think that most of our personal confrontations, those times that we go and we show someone their fault, I think most of them are about personal offenses. They're about disagreements over certain decisions. I think we're more likely to confront someone and point out their fault when we hurt our feelings or do something we don't like than when they've actually done something that was a deliberate defiance of the will and the word of God. Now, obviously, there are plenty of times that these overlap, but here's my confession to you. When someone has personally offended me, maybe on purpose, maybe without even knowing, that personal offense quickly becomes big time sin in my mind. If I'm honest, the times that I'm most likely to take and apply something like this passage are when I'm offended and I want an apology. When I read an email and someone's tone seems unpleasant, when someone's rude or unthoughtful, here's the thing. We are all going to experience times of personal offense because we take things the wrong way. And when we're already overstressed, we naturally start to take innocent comments and actions and assume that they're passive insults that are directed at us. We'll experience personal offense because other people lack grace and tact and social awareness. And sometimes they really are passive aggressive, and other times they're just clueless. And we need to use our discernment and consider whether these things are worth a private conversation. Sometimes it's worth a conversation because someone needs some help seeing the problem with the way they're talking or going about things. When you send me an email that's in all caps with exclamation points about things that you need me to do, it instantly makes me feel like you're yelling at me. I'm not saying that because any of you do that to me, but at least just to give you some language in case any of you are dealing with this. Can we all accept that a lot of personal offense comes because of people's weaknesses? Some of those offenses are because of other people's weaknesses. Some of those offenses are because of our own weaknesses. We're all at times insecure and oversensitive and inconsiderate and clueless about how our words and actions will affect other people. And I would call all of those things weaknesses. Don't confuse that with excuses. Don't confuse it with things that we shouldn't expect to improve. Don't confuse it with things that we should just ignore and not talk about. But don't be too quick to confuse it with sin here either. This passage is not talking about confronting people because of their weaknesses. It's talking about confronting people because of their wickedness. If your brother or sister sins, it says. I think the starting question here is different. I don't think it begins with, did someone hurt you? That's an important question, but it's not this question. This question is one for brothers and sisters in the church. Do you see someone living contrary to God's clear word and commands? Is there anyone who's a part of the community? They call themselves a Christian, and yet they're shamelessly living in a way that defies God's will. There may be some gray areas there, things that we're just not sure about. But there are also some rather black and white things. When people practice adultery, when they steal intentionally, when they live with an outright malice or envy toward other people, when they lie or slander, when they're living with evident greed, those are the kinds of things I think Jesus is discussing here. And I think we don't confront these as often because, well, they're not as personal to us. If we're honest, I think a lot of us are still so self-absorbed that we'll stay up at night thinking about that unkind word someone said to us. But these sins that don't directly affect us don't cause us to miss any sleep. So Dale Bruner, whom I've quoted several times recently, and you really should just go get his book on Matthew and read it cover to cover. He says this about these kinds of outright sins. He says, these are the sins that no self-respecting Christian community can tolerate in her midst without denying her charter. Some activities just go against the very nature of who we are. For the church to see outright sin among its members and do nothing about it, it would be like PETA members attending meetings in fur coats and no one saying anything about it. This quote, it hits on my real fear for myself, maybe for us as a community, that it would be easier for us to tolerate each other's wickedness than to tolerate each other's weaknesses. My prayer is that we would be a community that bears with each other in our weaknesses. I think that's part of being a community of love and forgiveness, but also that we would be a community that would not tolerate wickedness with each other. That may sound like a hard line, but I think it's just as necessary to being a real community of love and forgiveness. Let me come back to that thought in just a little bit, and I want to make a third observation first. So, third observation, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, it says. The way I read this, it's not an opportunity, it's a responsibility. It's not just an option, it's a command. If you know that someone in the church is sinning, you've got to go and talk to them. For how many of you is that uncomfortable? If you were here in person, I'd have you all raise your hands just to amplify the discomfort, or to highlight that it's pretty much all of us. I can tell you, for me, it's very uncomfortable. I don't love conflict. It would have been much nicer for me if Jesus had said here, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, unless you're an introvert, or you're uncomfortable with conflict, or you're scared it might damage your relationship, or you'd prefer someone else do it. But of course, it doesn't say any of those things. He just says go. And now, let's look at a few more details. What the rest of these verses say, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So how do we go? We go first by ourselves. You start by yourself. If you're going to confront someone about sin in their lives, don't have people who are ready to call afterward and ask you how it went. Maybe you ask someone to pray for an important conversation you're having, but leave it at that, because otherwise you start rallying a whole base of support before someone even knows what's coming. And none of us want to be on the receiving end of that, because it's possible that you can go, just you, and they'll listen, and you've won them over. If that doesn't happen, Jesus says, take 1 or 2 others to confirm things. And if that doesn't work, tell the church. Because there's a hope that they'll listen to the whole church, or perhaps to its leaders. Now, it's interesting. I think something that happens in the church today quite a bit is that someone goes and they tell the leaders and they say, you should know this and you should do something about it. And often they say, you should know this, but don't tell them that I told you. And so the first step is they tell it to the church. And they want the church, represented by its leaders, to go and do something with someone without them being involved. But you see here, Jesus says that's step 3. Go alone. You don't need to go tell the church leaders and have them do something about this person. Go to that person and talk to them. That has to be the first step. And I will tell you, if anyone comes to me and says, hey, this person is doing this and you should know, and I think you should do something about it, I usually encourage them, I urge them, why don't you're the one who already knew this, who saw it, who somehow is privy to it, why don't you go talk to them? And if they won't and they want me to, I'm always honest enough to say, I'm going to let them know you told me. I'm not going to play this game where I go to someone and say, hey, I found out, and they say, well, where did you find out? Oh, I can't say. We don't play those games. I'll go to them and say, yeah, this person told me, and now I wanted to talk to you about it. It's what you would want if you were on that side of the situation, and I think it's what all of us want to offer each other. So it says, finally, third, go and tell the church. And then it says, if they still don't listen, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And people have talked about this line in a lot of different ways. What does it mean to treat someone as a pagan or a tax collector? I think we can agree on at least this much. God's grace is still extended to them. We don't scorn them, but they're also not insiders. They're not leaders. They're not considered members of the church in the same way. They're considered loved people and even welcome in a lot of our spaces as people who we hope to win back, but not treated as leaders and full members of the church. all of this is the what. How do we deal with sin in the church? And it sounds pretty severe in some ways, doesn't it? Can we take some time to see the why behind all of this? In places that we've decided that Jesus' words are too severe, and so we don't take them seriously, in those places, I believe we haven't experienced more grace by overlooking Jesus' words. I believe we've actually experienced less. And so let's look at the why behind this. And we're going to do that by talking about the whole story of humanity. Here's the story of humanity. God created us to be his children, but sin wrecked our world. God created us for freedom to live as his children in a good world, but instead we became slaves to sin and to death. And the church believes that the real scourge on our earth is sin. We hate sin. We hate it because we believe God created a great and beautiful world, and sin has corrupted and polluted it. We hate sin because we believe God has made us to be incredible, beautiful people who reflect the glory of God, and sin's what distorts and destroys that, what keeps us from being the incredible creations God intends us to be. So we hate sin, and we don't make any issue of that. But we believe that a Messiah has come, Jesus. We believe that by his life and death and resurrection, God gave birth to the church and delivered us from slavery to sin and death. So you see, we start with people who were born for freedom, but ended up as slaves to sin and death. But then because of the Messiah's suffering and death and resurrection, there's new birth. We're no longer slaves to sin and death. And so even though we die, God's promise is that we will live forever. And though we were born in sin, we don't have to go on sinning. We're not slaves to that anymore. Why do we confront a brother or a sister who sins? We do it because we can't be a community of love and forgiveness without it. Can you love a brother or sister and watch them go back into slavery without fighting for them? You can't. Even if you don't like confrontation, or you're an introvert, or you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, at some point we acknowledge that when someone is supposed to be free and we see them being put back into slavery, the only loving thing to do is to go and to fight for them. And so in John's gospel, he says that Jesus came full of grace and truth. Isn't that an interesting combination? It reminded me of a diagram that I saw several years ago about parenting, and one that I've shared in our community a few times. That diagram, it compared love and discipline in parenting. Sometimes we think it has to be one or the other. Either be your kid's best friend or be your kid's drill sergeant. And so let me show you the diagram. See that? You have four large options. You have high love and high discipline, the authoritative parent. If you lack love, you're just authoritarian. You're just a dictator. Lots of love but not much discipline. You're a permissive or indulgent parent. And if you lack both of those, well, you're just negligent then. So guess which kids consistently do the best as they hit adolescence and adulthood? Yeah, it's a shocker, right? It's the kids who have the authoritative parents, the ones who are high on both love and discipline. And I wonder if a lot of the same could apply to the church and how we handle sin. I wonder how often we think grace and truth are in competition instead of to be used together. We withhold the truth because we think we're being gracious to someone. Or we get so focused on making sure people hear truth that there's not much grace evident in what we say. To be a real community of love and forgiveness, don't we have to have both? So if someone's walking back into slavery to sin, is there anything loving about withholding the truth, or does that just make us like indulgent parents? And when we talk to people about the truth, do we do it in such a way that we're constantly showing grace, showing that the goal is forgiveness, not just to chastise? So when Jesus says, if they listen to you, you have won them over. That word for winning them over, it's a missionary term. This is evangelism. This isn't about winning a point against anyone. It's about winning someone back to God's kingdom. In fact, If you've convinced someone that they were wrong or sinned in such a way that it was all truth and no grace, and now they want nothing to do with the church, or you for that matter, I suggest that you've lost. You've lost them. So take a look at the verses that come just after this. Matthew 18, verses 18 through 20. They say this: "Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three gather in my name, there am I with them." A few weeks ago, I preached about Jesus telling Peter and the disciples that he was giving them keys to the kingdom. I talked about binding and loosing there. Binding and loosing are about people coming into the kingdom, about them receiving God's grace and being freed from the terrible slavery of sin. And so now Jesus reminds us of those keys again. We have a big responsibility. And we're reminded that we're not alone. When even two or three of us gather, which in a lot of places right now is as many as there are, when even two or three of us gather, Christ is with us. When we gather and speak hard truth about sin, he's there with us. When we gather and we offer grace to each other, he's there with us. And when we gather and ask for someone to be freed from this horrible slavery to sin, he's there with us. And he says that if we come and ask, the Father will do it. So we usually take these as general statements about prayer or about gathering. Wherever two or three gather, he's with us. But I think they had a more specific purpose here. I think this has to do with fighting for someone's soul. When you come together in those hard times, he's present too. And so as you go into this week, I'll ask you to think of the people in your life. And think of any brother or sister who may have been in sin. And maybe this is something recent and something that you need to take immediately and do something about. Maybe there's something from the past that you recognize now you botched. There are too many occasions that I look back on and recognize I gave a lot of truth and very little grace. Actually, frankly, too many occasions where I recognize I gave a lot of what I thought was grace and very little truth. And some of those I've had to go back and apologize for. I spoke what I thought was a lot of truth to you, but in no gracious manner. And also a few where it was, hey, I saw what was going on and I waited way too long to say anything. And so whether it's perhaps even doing something to make up for a past error, whether it's an opportunity today to go and extend grace and truth to someone in the Christian family, perhaps right in your close circle, I'll encourage you to consider whether there's anyone that you should pray about and that you should go to. And wherever two or three gather, even if that's you and the person that you've gathered to confront, well, God is there with them. And so I pray God goes with you. God be with you this week, friends. Amen.